Thank you very much for yes. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be with you this morning. I always enjoy my conversations with my fellow Kiwi. So I tell you, I was there with my wife 4 years ago, and without a doubt, it was the very best holiday that we've ever had. And so I wish I were there in person, but this is the next best thing with technology. So let me share my screen and we'll get going. Get this PowerPoint up and going, and there we go. All right, bringing plants to life, the profit side of sustainability. Now you have a conference in which you're going to be focusing in on sustainability and the role that it plays within the green industry. And I'm going to speak to a number of different issues that you're going to be covering during the conference. But first things first, right? We got to get the important things out of the way first. I'd like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to the All Blacks for their being champions once again. So that's ever since my trip to New Zealand, I'm an All Black fan. So I appreciate catching the highlights over here when I can. So without, I didn't hear any applause in the background, but yeah, okay, that's it. All right, I appreciate it. All right, so now what the program that you have, the agenda that you have is on the left here. And one of the things that I'm sure that your moderators have been talking about is the fact that you're covering all the bases in terms of sustainable development. The diagram that you see on the right not only has the traditional 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, or prosperity in this case, but it's also talking about partnerships and peace as a part of that sustainable development. And of course, I think all 5 of those Ps, 4 of the 5 are at least covered in the workshop that you're attending. So I commend the leaders who put together this program because you're covering a lot of important topics. So my agenda today is very straightforward. I want to talk about some international green life sustainability trends, things that I see are happening that are going to foster the final demand for flower, shrubs, and trees and landscape services. So, and this is not simply in New Zealand, it's not simply in the US, it's worldwide that we're seeing these sustainability trends. The second thing I'll cover is sustainability as it appears in the green industry supply chain as of today and where we're headed in that direction. And then thirdly, does this make any difference to the consumer? The fact that if we produce plants more sustainably, or if we make our cities more sustainable, if we utilize green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure, do people even care? And obviously the answer to that is yes, but I'll show you some proof of that. And then all that could be true, but what if the economy worldwide collapses over the next 18 months? And I want to speak specifically to the economy there in New Zealand in terms of any recessionary pressures that the green industry is going to feel. And then lastly, I want to talk about what about plant demand in 2023? After all, 2020 and 2021 have been very kind to us worldwide in terms of people actually using more flowers, shrubs, and trees than they historically have. And will this consumption above trend continue, or are we going to see things go back to trend? So those are the topics that I'm going to cover over the next few minutes, and then we'll answer any questions. All right, so let's take the first topic, the international green life sustainability trends. And here I want to focus in on the big picture and then drill down to some smaller picture type of items. So let's start big. Let's talk about cities of the future. Without a doubt, thriving cities are going to be those that incorporate both gray and green in the development and in the everyday life of where people live, work, worship, and play. All right, so this is going to be an important concept. Now, as cities grow, obviously more and more people are moving towards living in urban areas. and they want to stay connected all the time, but they want to have the amenities of being out in nature, being in the rural areas, but they want the counter amenities of living in urban areas, right? So the way that we manage all this growth, and you see this superhighway, but you see all the urban forest and the plantings in between in order to maintain the sustainability, overall sustainability of this environment. So what used to be focused in on central business districts is now there's an element of central recreational districts that people can be outside, and that attention deficit recovery is much faster in the outdoors than it is indoors in the built environment. People actually are more compassionate and treat each other better. Their memory retention is much better when they're in the midst of flowers, shrubs, and trees than when they're in the midst of gray pavement and non-green buildings, right? So that's going to be very important. All of this within the city, we usually call green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. And the green infrastructure is critically important. And you see all these plants that are on the balconies of this particular building. It requires a horticultural knowledge that is greater than what the horticulture industry knew how to grow plants in this type of environment just a short decade ago. And now we're seeing this type of planting more and more frequently, right? So we're utilizing green infrastructure to solve the problems of urban environments, particularly in terms of stormwater mitigation. Now, cities will spend a lot of money putting in redundant piping to handle stormwater runoff. And this is worldwide, right? This isn't just New Zealand. It isn't just in the US. Worldwide, one of the things that taxpayer dollars goes towards is developing this gray infrastructure. And oftentimes they use redundant piping to handle that stormwater. Well, research shows that the cities save millions of dollars in terms of the cost of mitigating storm runoff if they incorporate their urban tree forest, if they incorporate the green infrastructure as I've been describing it, bioswales, green roofs, green walls. All of these are tools within the green infrastructure movement that is now giving us a voice. It's giving us a terminology in which we can talk to municipal leaders, and we can describe the benefits in monetary terms. So for many years, that was the number one thing I saw that was lacking, is that we could talk about the benefits of plants. We could talk about the benefits aesthetically of enhancing the beautification of our cities and so forth, our local communities. But it was very difficult to talk in terms of dollars and monetary terms. And what will move people, particularly local leaders, municipal and city leaders and so forth, what will move them to invest in flowers, shrubs, and trees versus redundant stormwater piping is when you start talking about monetary terms, right? You start talking about the number of jobs that are created, the local economic impact. That's what turns heads. Yes, these environments are pretty, but that's not what changes behavior. So when you put things in monetary terms, then it makes sense. We've heard about the circular economy, and of course, Sandy will be on right after me talking about the circular economy, and I won't steal any of her thunder. But in a nutshell, we move from a situation where we're thinking cradle to grave, where we produce things and we throw them away. And after many, many years, away fills up and we don't have anywhere else to put stuff. So we have to think differently in terms of mitigating waste, reuse, recycle, but in terms of a cradle to cradle mentality. And the green industry is ripe for that, because we're growing things and we're taking things out, we're composting, we're improving soil health. So all of these things help us to grow food as well as enhance the aesthetics of our environment. And of course, I mentioned reuse and recycle. And there are many companies. This is just one example of an allied trade company that is selling their products in more sustainable packaging. And this particular package happens to be produced with a plastic that incorporates a plant-based resin rather than a petroleum-based resin. And of course, in many parts of the world, including your own, there's more of a hypersensitivity to single-use plastics, as there should be. And so our industry is on the, well, we can be on the leading forefront of this, but if we simply, well, I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to get too far into some of the other speakers' presentations, but just know that we have a role to play, particularly in terms of job development. And of course, jobs are critically important in terms of any industry that's trying to affect change, right? So there are green collar jobs that are being created within the horticultural world day in and day out. We're using different technologies. We're using different production systems, both to grow food and to grow ornamental crops. And the generations that are up and coming, that is the millennial generation, the Gen Z generation, they have a much greater appreciation for those environmental amenities than even we boomers. I'm a baby boomer, just turned 60 years old, and boomers are why we're even in the room today, right? Because of the baby boomers and the demand that baby boomers had ever since World War II and building houses and so forth. And so we are in good hands with some of these up and coming generations because they appreciate the greenness every bit as much as the baby boomers. Now, technology, you're going to be talking about technology during the rest of the program today. And so horticulture is also utilizing technologies in terms of irrigation technologies, in terms of artificial intelligence, drones, robotics. There's a lot of exciting technologies that we can incorporate at the production level and at the retail level, at the landscape service sector. And then we can offer these technologies like you see pictured here to the end consumer. All right, so there's a number of technologies that are being developed that'll continue to be exciting. And of course, utilizing smartphone apps and enhancing the knowledge base of the end consumer and making them more knowledgeable, which makes them more successful. And we know that garden performance is the #1 thing that influences garden consumption, right? So if people are successful, they're going to buy more plants. If they're not, they're not. It's as simple as that. So we've got to make sure that we make people successful, and we make gardening and landscaping and maintaining these landscapes easier, right? So we can use robotic mowers and wireless plant sensors and so forth to make the job of maintenance much easier. And of course, pollination is very critical. We have a program here at Texas A&M University where we have research scientists that are developing these mechanical bees in order to pollinate, just in case. You know, we had sudden colony collapse that devastated much of the world's bee population. With no bees, no world, period. So we're developing the technologies just in case so that we can pollinate even without natural bees. Now I want to move into a different shift, and I want to stop my presentation right here because I want you to hear this. We just went through a global pandemic, and this global pandemic had destroyed the physical health of many people. And in fact, we lost a lot of people, and the death rates across the world skyrocketed over the last couple of years. However, there's one measure of health that has had traditionally less attention placed on it, and that's the mental health of our citizenry in our respective countries. And of course, the mental health affects physical health. It affects purchasing. It affects the way people view the world. It affects the level of social unity that we see. And in some respects, it may be some of the source of some of the disunity that we see worldwide. All right, so there's a strong emphasis that should be placed on mental health. Now, in 2019, I didn't know a pandemic was coming down the pike, but I wrote 4 journal articles, 1, 2, 3, 4, on the health and well-being benefits of flowers, shrubs, and trees, of the things that you produce, that you install in the landscapes, that you sell at your retail store. I talked about the physiological benefits to our bodies of being in the midst of flowers, shrubs, and trees in 1 journal article. This entire 2nd journal article, I talked about the cognitive and the emotional and the mental benefits that we derive just in being in the midst of those plants. And in fact, all the plants that you see in the room right there in front of you on the stage and so forth, because those plants are in the room, not only are those scrubbing volatile organic compounds out of the air, not only are they providing oxygen for you, but people, when they're in the midst of plants, they feel more relaxed. The cortisol levels in the body go dramatically down. Their memory, their concentration improves, and their memory retention increases by as much as 25%. So you would have learned a lot today at this conference, but you're going to be learning a lot more because you have plants in the conference room with you than you would have otherwise. Now, folks, they look at me sometimes and say, wait a minute, come on. No, over 3,000 research citations I have collected since 2008 regarding the health and well-being benefits, over 3,000 research citations. And many of those came not from the horticulture world. They came from the medical profession. They came from the psychological field, right? So those fields of study have done us in this room a lot of favors by doing all this research, because it documents the benefits from a health and well-being standpoint of what you do. So I want to call out special emphasis of that. And you should really leave the conference today feeling even more proud of what you do than what you are already. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. Nature's RX, nature's prescription for mental wellness, is so important that doctors in both in the UK and also doctors in Canada are now prescribing time spent outdoors as part of their regimen for treating patients, right? So it makes that big a difference because it happens in the mind before it happens in the body. And so taking care of the mind and the mental wellness is an important element of what we provide as an industry. Now, during the pandemic, we were sheltering in place. I couldn't come to New Zealand, right? And so it's a good thing that my wife and I had been there. Of course, we only experienced the North Island. We didn't make it to the South Island. And so we're looking forward to being back and experiencing that element of your country, which I love so much. So the social element during the pandemic was so constricted that many young people, like you see depicted in this picture, they came together in a social environment around plants, right? Now, sometimes they met in person like this, but in a lot of cases they met online just to talk about their parent, their plant kids, right? So they were plant parents, and they were sharing their experiences of growing succulents or house plants, et cetera, right? So it's a means of knitting together that social fabric within a community. Just look at community gardens or school gardens. Let me stop right here again. I get off on these tangents. Right? This is very passionate for me. kids in schools that have school gardens, there's less instances of racial instances. There's less instances of bullying. Kids are better behaved. They perform better on standardized tests. There's less turnover among the teachers. So that whole social fabric that we bring to our communities is very important. All right, so let me go back to the PowerPoint. I'll get off on these tangents because it's exciting for me to talk about it. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know you guys get it, but we need to talk more about that. All right, so let's talk about sustainability in the green industry supply chain. Now, from a manufacturing and distribution standpoint, there's a number of companies that you see depicted here that either certify the sustainability-ness of our companies, of our processes. There's different packaging that we're using now that it's more sustainable than black plastic. I would imagine in 10 years, we may not see a single plant being produced in black plastic. Right? It'd be different alternative materials. The way that we heat our greenhouses, use the wood chips and so forth in our boilers. Our flowers that we sell, we use biodegradable floral foam. Right? So there's a number of different examples, including plant protection products. The way we treat diseases and insects and the way we provide nutrition for plants are going to be markedly different. For growers, we're going to see the products that they grow, we're going to see more emphasis on the benefits that they provide to the environments in which they're planted, right? We're going to see more recycling efforts, more solar energy, more integrated pest management practices, all the things that Clive will be talking about later in terms of the Lincoln University plant production research and so forth. A lot of that is trying to stay on the leading edge of plant production, right? Where you use biofuels in our delivery trucks. We'll talk about water conservation and the importance of plants and the role that they play in terms of water conservation and wildfire prevention. Now, that's one thing that we've learned in Texas. Now, there's a study that I conducted with a colleague of mine several years ago that looked at the carbon footprint and the water footprint of landscape plants. And we utilized a life cycle assessment where we looked at every single material that was used, every chemical, every piece of equipment, all the energy inputs, all the labor inputs, and we looked at field production. And what we saw here, these two pieces of the pie, loading and unloading and harvest. Well, when you're growing trees, in this case, or shrubs in the field, right? This is a redbud tree. Most of the carbon footprint is associated with the harvesting stage and then loading and unloading on the trailers and into the eventual truck to be delivered. Now, for pot and pot production, this is one thing I don't know whether you utilize a lot there, but we have a pot that's in the ground and we stick the plant, usually a tree, in the pot that's in the ground to keep it from falling over. And so obviously the substrate represents a lot of the carbon footprint and the pots represent a lot of the carbon footprint. And in traditional containers, we looked at the production of Bennett's compacta holly in 3-gallon containers. And obviously the fertilization, the container, the liner, a lot of that made up the carbon footprint. Bottom line, right? I don't have time to go into great detail about those studies, but number one, we know that the more that growers know about carbon footprint and the variable cost of these sustainable cultural practices, it helps increase efficiency. There's a correlation between being more sustainable and more efficient. Now that's an important point because for many years, people felt if I'm more sustainable, it adds to my cost of production. All of the research shows that when your cultural practices are more sustainable, you actually incur fewer costs, right? You lower your cost by being more sustainable. It's counterintuitive, I know, but research shows it time and time again. The other thing is that a few inputs and a few processes during production account for most of the carbon footprint and most of the variable cost. So it's not, even though we're looking at a life cycle assessment, just a few of those things like harvesting the trees and the equipment that we had to use and the fossil fuels that were burned in that equipment, that's what generates the most carbon footprint. But we know this, that if you consider it from an entire life cycle perspective, the greenhouse gas emissions during shrub and tree production are vastly outweighed by the carbon that's sequestered while the shrubs and trees are in the landscape, right? So we have a vastly positive carbon footprint. We need to tell more people about that. We're part of the answer. Now, I missed the first speaker this morning, but I would imagine when she was talking about rethinking plastics and beyond, that point was made, is that even though our industry uses a lot of black plastic currently, still our carbon footprint is vastly more positive than it would be otherwise. But here's the thing, we got to quit talking about turf grass versus shrubs versus flowers versus trees. There's little doubt that a tree over a 60-year or 100-year lifespan will sequester a lot more carbon than a pansy will during one growing season, right? And that the carbon footprint of growing those annual flowers, even though they look pretty, the carbon footprint's not as positive as a tree because the plant's just not in there as long as in the ground as a tree is. But we cannot get into those kind of wars internally when we talk about municipalities and the regulatory aspects within municipalities. We as an industry need to focus on landscape systems and talk about the overall beneficial carbon footprint of the landscape system, as well as the positive water footprint of that landscape system. Because environments that don't have enough green infrastructure flood, and there's substantial damage, et cetera, right? So we need to talk about the benefits of the landscape system as a whole. That way, we're viewed as more of a necessity in people's lives versus a luxury. Because when it comes down to water, I live in Texas, it's a very dry environment. When it comes down to making a decision about whether to water people or to water plants, people win every time. But if we're going to have a seat at the table and get our fair share of water to produce plants, to install them, to enjoy them in our landscapes, we've got to show the water conservation elements of what we provide as well. All right, so let me go back here, share my screen. And then last but not least, the industry needs to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, nobody else is going to talk about it for us. All right, now it brings me to the point, does this make any difference to consumers? You know, see this lady here in the picture, she's within the garden center and she's trying to pick out, you know, what plants she's going to decide on. And there's a lot of algorithms going through her mind all at the same time. Now, some of the research that I do involves eye tracking and it involves biometrics. And we put sensors on people's temples and so forth, and we track their eyes either with special glasses or with special tools that we put on computer screens. We can have them walk down the garden center aisle with these glasses. We see where they look, and there is a correlation between where people look and where they resonate and the likelihood of purchase, but not all the time, right? So that's where the biometrics comes in, because we can measure the facial, whether people smile, whether they smile with their eyes or whether they smile with their mouth. We can actually predict the emotion that people are feeling when they walk through the garden center or when they see pictures of some of our landscapes. And we know that most purchasing decisions are made in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and that lights up just like a Christmas tree in the presence of plants. In fact, there's only one other product that has shown that lights up the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain. If you show the imagery, There's only one other product that creates that kind of lighting up like a Christmas tree, and that's drug use. And of course, we're a vastly more legal alternative to people using drugs to get that same high within their brain. So it's fascinating research. So does it make a difference? Yeah. Here's some research that shows when people are buying flowers, they as part of their purchasing decision, 28% of them said if it's produced organically that it's important to them, or if it's produced with fair labor standards, 40% said it's important to them. If it's locally sourced, 37%. If it's grown in biodegradable pots, 32%. Biodegradable sleeves, right? All of these things, these are not really high percentages out of 100, from 0 to 100. But here's the thing. 5 short years ago, they were single digits. So we had this much growth over the course of just 5 years. So yeah, it's making a difference. I did some research about 8 years ago or 9 years ago now, where we looked at different alternative media, or the different alternative containers that we could sell the plants. We use rice hull pots or straw pots, or what was called OP47, is made out of wheat starch instead of petroleum distillates. And in every case, the willingness to pay was higher with the alternative pots. It's just that the expense of those was also higher, and the industry wasn't willing to pay for it at the time. Right? If we labeled something as carbon saving, we could charge 17 cents more. People were willing to pay 17 cents more just because it was carbon saving. And then, of course, if we were utilizing waste products, there was a benefit there as well. If we're selling houseplants and we can document how many volatile organic compounds are being removed from the air, because in the conference there, in the conference room with you right there, you see I think you've got carpet, and you've got some paint on the wall, paint on those columns and so forth, all the man-made options that share organic compounds, and we're breathing those every single day. Now, obviously not at a lethal dose, but all the plants that you have in the room are helping to scrub those particulates, and it helps to scrub all of those volatile organic compounds out of the air, right? So it's a minor thing. We put those in there probably to make the room look better. But consumers, when we told them that these VOCs could be removed, the willingness to pay increased, right? When we told folks that these particular plants were pollinator friendly, there was a premium that was you can see right there. There's a positive premium in both the models that we ran in terms of what people are willing to pay for those plants. But we need to not only consider the benefits to the individual consumer, but in public spaces as well, right? We need rating systems. And here in the States, we use the sites, the Sustainable Sites Initiative, where we're not only looking at the LEED certification for buildings, but we have the site certification for landscapes. So we have green buildings, and we have either platinum certified landscapes to go along with those platinum certified LEED buildings, right? So it's not us versus the hardscape. It's not us versus the buildings. It's working in synergy, right? And so the landscape architects are catching on to that and designing what sustainable landscapes really are. And when we do this, it fits with the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. Now, the Green Building Council, this graphic right here shows all the ways in which green buildings align with there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN put together several years ago. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of those 17 that the Green Building Council says, if you put green roofs, green walls, net zero water use, and you make the buildings green, this is how you're enhancing those Sustainable Development Goals. We've done the same within the green industry. There's the Horticultural sustainability initiative. Most of the green infrastructure related benefits that I talked about earlier are tied to this number 11, sustainable cities and communities. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other of these benefits, the sustainable development goals that are addressed by plants. All right, so that's why we're important. Now, let me get down to some things that are going to affect you as green industry participants where you live right now. In terms of all this sounds good, and it may increase the likelihood to purchase. It may increase the willingness to pay on the part of the consumer. But if there's too much inflation and we're in a recession, that can be a counterbalance to all the benefits that I've been talking about. It can be a counter effect and affect consumption negatively for flower, shrubs, and trees. So let's talk about that a little bit. Your growth rate is depicted right here. This is GDP for New Zealand. And you can see that the quarterly and annual growth are shown here. And the pandemic, of course, decreased GDP right in the initial part of the pandemic. But then over here on the right-hand side, I got to move my webcam out of the way here. On the right-hand side, you can see post-pandemic, bang, people started buying. That's the only thing we could do. We were sheltering in place. We had to buy stuff. Sometimes we bought it online. So, but your GDP jumped significantly. And then over on the right-hand side, it fell off here recently as well. Why? Well, you've got a lot of inflation and so forth that you're dealing with. The supply chain is disrupted. Now here I have a supply chain pressure gauge. And on the left-hand side, all of this is too small. I'm not expecting you to read anything on this particular slide, but green is good, yellow is okay, and then red means bad, right? Or it's too expensive. So all these indicators of the supply chain show the volume of product that's moved through the system, how long it takes, the price, inventory levels, and then lastly, the labor. You can see before the pandemic, most of this was green. And during the pandemic, a lot of these indicators, of course, red. Lead times increase for buying containers, buying media, and so forth. The cost increased, the container cost. And you can see on the far right-hand side, this is today. And you see more of those indicators turning green or yellow. The ones that are still yellowish red there are labor related. Everybody's having difficulty finding labor, right? So, but the supply chain is getting better, but it's going to take another year from where we are right now, another year for really the rest of the supply chain to normalize as much as it's going to, because there's some de-risking that's going on in the supply chain. There's a metamorphosis, there's some changing. So some of the players are going to change in the supply chain, but it's going to take another year for us to sort all that out. Now, inflation. Here's another chart. You can see your CPI index. It's been a long time, right, since you had, over here on the left-hand side, it's been a long time since you've seen inflation at this level. And your central bank, of course, is raising interest rates as a means of combating that, to try to slow down the economy enough where we can generate a soft landing, cut back on consumption just enough, cut back on production just enough to bring inflation under control, and then we can take off on our growth pattern again. So the consumer price index is higher. The cost of inputs is higher. I calculate an index of prices paid by growers, and my own research shows that in 2021, everything that you're using to produce plants, containers, media, the propagated materials, the fertilizers, labor, all that increased 10%, 10.1%, 21 over 20. I have forecasted for this year an 8% increase in input cost over last year. And then for 2023, I'm forecasting another 4% increase, 3.6% increase in those cost of inputs. What does that mean for us? Well, you've been able to get some higher prices through the pandemic when your input cost increased, we've seen a willingness to pay on the part of the consumer. We're going to have just a little bit more price increase. Now, what's the likelihood of recession there in New Zealand? Well, it's pretty high because it's pretty high in the rest of the world too. And all the developed countries are in the same boat. High inflation, the central banks raising rates, adjusting the balance sheet within the central bank. And so there's a likelihood of recession occurring in many parts of the world. And you take Europe, for example, when Russia lost its mind and invaded Ukraine, that created a whole circumstance of supply chain disruptions, and it's going to take a while to recover. So there will be a recession. How deep? I don't think it's going to be as deep as the Great Recession. There's too many things that are going for you there in New Zealand. There's too many indicators, economic indicators that are positive. The things I tend to focus on are the housing sector. And here you see the new dwellings consented, we call them business permits, or the housing permits here in the US. But those consentings you saw during the pandemic, the slope of that line increased dramatically. You'd had growth ever since the Great Recession, but that increased dramatically. And of course, that's now tailing off again. So the housing market there is cooling off. And as mortgage rates continue to increase with the interest rates, it's going to cool off anymore. Why is that important? Because every new house requires flowers, shrubs, and trees to be around it, right? It's a law of nature. You got to put flowers, shrubs, and trees. It's not a law, but it should be. But still, people are going to buy fewer if there's fewer houses. And then if you look at the earnings, the wages, you can see the level of wages, whether you're male or female, and are at an all-time high, right? So GDP is a product of the number of people working and productivity. And if the number of people working is at a reasonable level, but the cost of keeping those people employed increases, that of course affects corporate profitability. Now, let me tie it all together. I got 4 minutes left. Let me talk about the plant demand, because I said earlier that plants, we saw more plants during worldwide. We saw more plants during 2021 than I think we'd ever seen before, right? It was that good of a year. It was the perfect storm in our favor in terms of people staying at home and doing more gardening and landscaping. So there's some questions though in my mind. Is number one, is the consumer going to pull back on their lawn and garden spending because of inflation cutting their budget? They got to pay their rent, got to buy food, got to put gas in the car. And with inflation to where it is, there's fewer disposable dollars that they can spend on plants. So are they going to pull back because of that? Secondly, are they going to spend more on lawn and garden during the midst of a recession? History says they will, because anytime they're staying at home more, they buy more plants. But have consumers pulled those purchases forward in time? Did they buy so much during the pandemic that they're going to not buy as much for the next 2 or 3 years? I don't know the answer to that. Will purchasing ornamentals decrease whenever this correction in the housing occurs at a higher rate than what it has been? And then lastly, will certain plant categories like mixed containers, are they going to be in demand even if a recession starts? Because again, people on their patios, they need to have planters and so forth, and they need some sort of luxury to make themselves feel better. So are we going to be better off when this occurs, or are we going to be worse off? As an economist, I see there's positives and there's negatives. So I really don't know for sure, but I know this: every business that's in the room has got to do these 3 things, right? You got to stress test your supply chain, right? You got to have backup suppliers and so forth. You got to make sure that you're executing efficiently and that you're providing the highest level of service so that those repeat customers keep repeating their purchasing. And then secondly, you got to offset those input cost increases with value-based pricing. You got to lead with the value proposition, why it is that people should buy plants to begin with, and why it is that they should buy from you, right? You got to start with why. And then lastly, you got to explore some cost resilience. You got to find lower cost alternatives to lower cost resources, and you got to develop capabilities in the midst of all this sustainability opportunity, develop capabilities, but you got to do it at a lower cost framework, right? Everybody probably has a strategic plan. If you don't have it written down, you got it in your brain. You got to work your plan. It's there for a reason, right? So I think I have exactly used up my time. I don't know if anybody will allow a quick question or two, but I've finished right on my allotted time. So let me turn it back over to the moderator, and we'll see if there's any time for questions.